Wimbledon has hosted royalty, legends, and enough strawberries and cream to feed a small nation, but nobody walked into this year's championships expecting a 20-year-old from Quezon City to turn the grounds into something that looked more like a family reunion than a tennis tournament. And yet that's exactly what happened. Because suddenly the cameras weren't just chasing tennis balls anymore, they were chasing flags. They were chasing chants. They were chasing a wave of noise that no one on the organizing committee had quite planned for. So the question worth asking is simple. How did Alex become the single biggest attraction on these grounds before she'd even lifted a trophy? And why did the entire sport stop what it was doing and pay attention? Because the honest answer says a lot more about where tennis is heading than it does about any one match. And it starts with something almost funny when you think about it. The biggest conversation happening across the entire tournament grounds had almost nothing to do with the players everyone expected to be talking about. While the reigning world number one was fielding tough questions about pressure and burnout and the emotional toll of a brutal season, another player entirely was arriving in London carrying something far heavier than a ranking number. She was carrying an entire country's hopes on her shoulders. And before she'd even struck her first competitive ball of the tournament, the atmosphere trailing her around the grounds felt like nothing the All England club had ever really prepared for. And it wasn't simply because she'd become a dangerous floater capable of shocking bigger names. It was because somewhere along the way she'd become the face of a movement that Philippine tennis had been quietly waiting decades for. One press conference room that week belonged to the top-ranked player in the world, a woman who had already proven, repeatedly, that she was the best in the business. The other belonged to a 21-year-old making history simply by showing up with a seed next to her name. And if you'd asked anyone with a basic understanding of sports media which of those two press conferences would generate more buzz, the answer should have been obvious, except it wasn't, because Alex's session lit up timelines and comment sections in a way that had nothing to do with traditional tennis rankings and everything to do with story. And if there's one thing modern sports fandom has taught us over and over again, it's that popularity doesn't always follow the rankings sheet. Sometimes it follows a narrative, and very few narratives in recent tennis memory have built momentum as quickly or as organically as this one. But here's the important part. None of this actually happened overnight. If you'd only just discovered her name because of a viral clip or a trending hashtag, it might have looked like some sudden explosion out of nowhere. But anyone who'd actually been paying attention for the last few years knew better. They remembered the junior success. They remembered the early breakthrough performances on tour that hinted at something bigger. They remembered the steady, patient climb that convinced people close to Philippine tennis that history might actually be forming in real time. And by the time Wimbledon rolled around the summer, those early believers weren't trying to convince anybody of anything anymore. The results were doing the talking all on their own, because only days before setting foot in London, Alex had already claimed the biggest grass court trophy of her career out in Birmingham. And winning on grass, for anyone who doesn't follow the sport closely, is genuinely one of the hardest things to do in tennis. The surface rewards split-second reactions, near flawless movement, and an almost stubborn level of self-belief. Most young players need years just to feel comfortable on it, let alone win a title, and yet Alex handled that entire week with a maturity well beyond her years, grinding through tough matches before walking away with a trophy. And if you rewind just slightly further, the run into that title was arguably even more impressive, because at the Berlin Open right before Birmingham, she announced herself properly as a legitimate threat by beating Elena Rybakina during a run that only ended in the semifinals against Linda Noskova. And let's be clear about what that actually means. Beating one of the most dangerous servers and ball strikers in the entire women's game, on grass of all surfaces, is not something you can chalk up to a lucky afternoon. That kind of result demands real tactical discipline, fearless shot selection, and the composure to stay locked in against someone who can end a point in one swing. And those wins completely changed the conversation around her, because they made Alex the first Filipino player in history to walk into a Grand Slam as a seeded competitor, and that milestone carries weight that stretches far beyond one individual career. Tennis, for the better part of a century, has been dominated by a small handful of nations with deep development systems, generations of coaching infrastructure, and a long lineage of champions passing knowledge down. The Philippines, despite a massive population and a genuinely passionate sporting culture, had simply never produced a player who reached this particular level. And now, almost overnight, that drought was over, and every single practice session she completed on these grounds felt like another page being added to her country's sporting history. Meanwhile, just a short walk across the grounds, the tournament's actual top seed was dealing with a very different kind of media cycle, because the reigning world number one remained, without argument, one of the most powerful and dominant competitors in the sport. But her build-up to this Wimbledon had very little to do with forehands or serve speed, and almost everything to do with headlines about mental fatigue following a difficult stretch after Roland Garros. Reporters weren't asking her about her backhand, they were asking about recovery, about resilience, about whether she could reclaim her rhythm while defending her position at the very top of the rankings, and there's something almost poetic about that contrast if you sit with it for a second. One player spent her press conference explaining recent struggles, while another spent hers talking about opportunity, about history, about the overwhelming wave of support arriving from home. And this wasn't some brand new phenomenon either, because earlier in the season, back at the Australian Open, Alex's press conferences and match highlights had already been pulling in remarkably strong engagement online despite her walking in without anywhere near the reputation of an established Grand Slam champion. Tennis fans were clearly curious about her, but it wasn't only neutral fans clicking those videos out of mild interest. There was already a massive, deeply devoted community of Filipinos scattered across the globe who had adopted her as their sporting ambassador, following every single tournament with a kind of enthusiasm you don't often see attached to a player who hadn't even won a major yet. And that passion became genuinely impossible to ignore once the tournament reached Melbourne. Journalists covering that event described crowds gathering around her outside court in numbers large enough to catch tournament organizers off guard. So much so that the event itself later admitted, in an unusually candid moment, that scheduling her on one of the smaller courts had badly underestimated public demand. And looking back now, that admission reads like an early warning sign that something much bigger than one talented young player was quietly taking shape, and the excitement surrounding her only intensified further after that Birmingham title, because a simple message she shared afterward carried enormous emotional weight, and it resonated instantly with millions of Filipinos living both inside and outside the Philippines who recognized a piece of themselves in those words. Athletes don't always set out to become symbols. It often just happens to them. But in that moment, Alex seemed completely at ease stepping into that role. And that's really the piece that explains why the atmosphere trailing her felt fundamentally different from the usual buzz surrounding a promising young talent. Fans weren't just showing up to celebrate wins on a scoreboard. They were showing up to celebrate representation, to see themselves reflected on one of the biggest stages the sport has to offer. Every single match she played became an opportunity for people who had rarely, if ever, seen their country prominently featured in elite tennis to wave flags, wear their national colors proudly, and genuinely believe that one of their own belonged in the same conversation as the sport's biggest names. And as the tournament got underway, analysts increasingly floated the idea that this could become the event where Alex properly announced herself to the wider sporting world beyond just tennis diehards. The draw itself even seemed to be teasing something bigger, dangling the possibility of a blockbuster meeting somewhere down the road with a returning legend if both players kept advancing, and that returning legend's comeback had already become one of the defining storylines of the entire championships on its own, meaning Alex suddenly found herself sharing headline space with one of the greatest players in the history of the sport before she'd even played her way that deep into the draw. And on the complete opposite side of the bracket, the tournament's most dominant active player kept chasing the only thing that's ever really mattered to her, another Grand Slam title, and no serious observer on the planet questioned her ability to dominate an opponent once she found her rhythm, that serve, those relentless ground strokes, that fearless competitive streak. All of it had earned her the #1 ranking for very good reason. But while she continued grinding toward another major, Alex was chasing something that simply can't be measured by trophies or ranking points alone. She was chasing belief, she was chasing proof, both for herself and for an entire nation watching every point back home. And if you go back and watch her opening match here at Wimbledon against Mexico's Renata Zarazua, the numbers alone tell a pretty compelling story: an emphatic 6-1, 6-2 victory, 82% of first serves landing in, 22 winners against just 14 unforced errors, a +8 ratio that speaks to a player who was locked in from the very first point. She broke early in the second set, consolidated that break for a 2-love lead, and even when Zarazua managed to hold and briefly slow the bleeding, Alex simply reeled off 3 straight games to push the lead out to 5-1 before calmly serving the whole thing out. That win didn't just get her into the second round, it made her the first Filipina in history to reach that stage at Wimbledon, and it set up a matchup that immediately felt like it belonged in its own category entirely, because waiting for her in round 2 was Maya Joint. And if that name means something to you already, it's because these two have unfinished business dating back exactly 1 year, to the 2025 Eastbourne Open Final, a match that, by every account from people who were actually there, ranks among the best of that entire grass court season. That final was where Alex became the first Filipina ever to reach a WTA Tour Championship match, and the demand to watch it caught absolutely everyone off guard. Walkways were packed, queues stretched across the grounds. Plenty of fans simply couldn't find a seat because interest had blown past every reasonable expectation. Even broadcasters who'd been covering the sport for decades admitted afterward they'd rarely seen that kind of overwhelming, grassroots support for a player who hadn't yet properly broken through on the Grand Slam stage. And the match itself lived up to every bit of that hype and then some, because Alex actually held championship points in that final. She was that close to lifting her first WTA trophy, and somehow, in one of the most gut-wrenching sequences you'll see in tennis, Maia clawed her way back from the brink and escaped with the title, winning a marathon third-set tiebreak by the barest of margins after saving 4 separate championship points along the way. And that's the kind of result that doesn't just end a match, it leaves a mark. So now, exactly a year later, these two were walking back out to face each other again, only this time it wasn't for a WTA trophy, it was for a spot in the third round of the biggest tournament in tennis. Maia had already described their first meeting as an epic battle, and Alex, for her part, made it clear she was excited for the chance to fix whatever had gone wrong for her in the biggest moments of that Eastbourne final. And here's the thing that made this rematch feel so different from their first meeting, because in the year since Eastbourne, these two careers had gone in almost completely opposite directions. Alex had kept climbing steadily, methodically, no longer treating big results as pleasant surprises but as expectations she genuinely believed she could meet, and that quiet, settled confidence became one of the defining threads of her entire season. Filipino communities scattered across Britain, Australia, North America, and dozens of other countries found themselves rallying behind a player who had come to represent something much bigger than individual ambition. Every single one of her matches turned into an opportunity to celebrate national pride, and that kind of atmosphere isn't something a tournament can manufacture or fake. And honestly, it isn't something they could ignore either. And that whole phenomenon says something interesting about how dramatically the sports landscape has shifted in the digital age. 20 years ago, a talented young player from Southeast Asia would have depended almost entirely on traditional television deals to build any kind of international following. But Alex's rise unfolded in a completely different world. Every spectacular rally, every emotional post-match interview, every glimpse behind the curtain of her training could circulate to the other side of the planet within minutes. Fans who'd never set foot inside a professional tennis venue could still feel plugged into every step of her journey in real time. And supporters living thousands of miles apart from each other found common ground celebrating the same victories together online. And that journey certainly hadn't been a straight line upward either, because earlier in the year, at the Australian Open, she grabbed the first set in commanding fashion before ultimately falling in the opening round. And Roland Garros had ended earlier than she'd hoped for as well, with another disappointing exit following shortly after at Bad Homburg right before the grass swing that led into Wimbledon. And those kinds of setbacks, stacked one after another, would tempt plenty of young players to start hunting for excuses, to blame the conditions or the draw or the schedule. But Alex chose a completely different path. She owned the disappointment publicly. She accepted responsibility for the performances that fell short, and instead of dwelling on what went wrong, she immediately turned her attention toward preparing for the next opportunity in front of her. And that mindset paid off almost instantly, because only days after speaking candidly about the frustration of that Bad Homburg exit, she showed up in Birmingham looking refreshed instead of rattled. Her confidence snapped back almost immediately, and so did the results. Rather than letting one rough week define an entire grass season, she turned it into exactly the preparation she needed heading into the biggest tournament on the calendar. And sure, fans obviously wanted to see her push deep into the draw here at Wimbledon, but what they were really witnessing went beyond any single scoreline. Every packed practice court, every flag waving somewhere in the stands, every broadcast camera following her out to the practice courts reinforced one simple idea, that tennis was finally welcoming in an audience it had never properly reached before. And whether or not she ever ends up lifting a Grand Slam trophy, she had already expanded the sport's global conversation in a way very few players managed this early into their careers. And now here we are, with Alex and Maia walking back out onto the grass together, not in a quiet regional final this time, but under the bright lights of Wimbledon itself, in front of a crowd split between fierce Filipino support and a hungry Australian underdog story of its own. And if you strip away all the numbers, all the rankings, all the seeding lines, what you're really left with is two young women trying to answer the exact same question in two completely different ways. Who actually has what it takes to seize the biggest moments when the whole sport is watching? And that's precisely why this match became the story everyone kept coming back to. More than the seeded stars, more than the defending champions, more than any of the household names occupying the show courts that week. Because championships create legends, sure, but stories like this one create something longer lasting than a trophy. They create movements. And by the time this particular grass season reached its climax, one thing had become impossible to argue with. Alex wasn't just participating in Wimbledon anymore, she became one of the defining